Hello, everyone. Good evening. I see we still have people entering the meeting, but I'm going to start in. My name is Chris Harwood, and as you can see from the background behind me, I'm today representing two organizations that have teamed up to bring you our program this evening. I am president of the New York chapter of the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences, that's SVUNY. And this is originally our program that we worked out with our fellow SVU member, Mary Stegmaier. But we've got Harwood Institute on board. That is my other hat. Of course, I'm lecturer in Czech at Columbia University. And Harwood is helping us out with the technical side of running this webinar and of course with publicity as well. So it's a joint project. And we've also had another sponsor join us, and that's the Institute for Human Rights at Columbia. And on behalf of SVU, the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences, I would like to ask you if you have any feedback on our program, send it to us at the email address you see here, newyork@svu2000.org. And we'd also like to encourage you to come check out our YouTube channel. We'll be posting this program there. And we would really love it if you would subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can get to the status we need to have a named domain there for our channel. We're just an anonymous number for now. I would just like to give you a little more on our speaker. Mary Stegmaier is the Vice Provost for International Programs and an Associate Professor in the Truman School of Public Affairs at the University of Missouri. As a scholar of comparative politics, she has spent extensive time, not excessive, I hope, conducting research in the Czech Republic. And her work on international elections and voting behavior has been published in academic journals. And she's contributed to the Washington Post and the Brookings Institution blog. And she has also very notably for tonight's program served as an international election observer with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that's OSCE, in Albania, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Macedonia. And so we're all delighted to have Mary with us here for our program to tell us about Belarus and elections monitoring there. She is also willing to entertain questions at the end of the program, potentially on elections observation here in the United States.
Great, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in your series. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Mary Stegmaier. I'm a faculty member in the Truman School of Public Affairs at the University of Missouri, and I also lead international programs for the university. So today what I'm going to talk about is international election observation, and specifically the election observation procedures of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I'll also then talk about my experiences observing the 2016 parliamentary election in Belarus, which of course is of interest today because for the past 2 months, Belarus has been engaged in a full-fledged democratic uprising. So we'll talk about that, the status of that at the end of this presentation. So I wanted to say just a couple words about the images that I have on this screen. So on the left, this is a Belarusian flag. It's not the official flag of the country right now. The white, red, white was the flag of the country between 1991 and 1995. So in this period, after the country became independent, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and until those 4 years, until the current president or dictator Lukashenka decided to make the changes to the Belarusian flag, and the flag on the right that you see with the green stripe in it is the current official flag of the country. You'll see both of these flags throughout my presentation, but the white, red, white flag is the one that the Democratic opposition is currently using. Okay. So I always like to start these presentations with a map just to help viewers orient themselves to where Belarus is, who its neighbors are. So on the map on the left, obviously you see Europe, and Belarus is located along the Russian border. It also borders with Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. It is not a member of the European Union, but obviously it is in this sort of buffer area between Russia and some of the European Union countries, including Poland. On the right is a more focused map of Belarus, and you can see Minsk is the capital, located right in the center of the country. And where I did the election observation in 2016, in the far south, you will see Mazir. It's on the Pripyat River. And it was a particularly interesting place to be observing because, as you can see right across the border in Ukraine, is Chernobyl. And this region of Belarus was particularly impacted by the nuclear catastrophe that happened in Chernobyl because the wind happened to be blowing toward the northwest, and so all the radioactive materials blew over that particular area. So what I'll talk about today is, first I'll talk about how OSCE election observation works. I'll then talk about my experiences there in 2016 in Belarus, and then wrap up saying a few words about the current democratic uprising that is happening in the country. So the purpose of election observation. It's important to note that we do make a distinction between election observation and election monitoring. Monitoring is actually where there are experts in the country and they are telling poll workers or election administrators what to do. And the OSCE is observing, so we really are observing. We can ask questions, of course, but we are not instructing poll workers what to do while we are in polling places or interacting with different election stakeholders. So the purpose of election observation is to observe and assess the election in terms of primarily two things: international standards for democratic elections. So there are documents and agreements that the OSCE member countries have signed onto that outline what democratic practices need or ought to be in place, or countries should be striving for those. And then also we assess compliance with the national laws that are in place governing the election process. And this is important because in any country, or in the United States and states, we have laws that govern how the entire process of administering an election. But it also relies on county clerks in the United States or municipal election officials abroad and poll workers to follow these laws. So are poll workers well trained? Are they following the guidance that they have? This means that as election observers, we need to be trained, and we are trained on the election laws of that country that apply to that specific election. The focus of the observation is on the process. The OSCE does not speak out about the outcome of the election. So they do not criticize if it is, for example, an extremist party that wins or a dictator that wins. The focus will be on the actual election process. Ultimately, the OSCE has a news conference the day after the election to discuss preliminary findings, but they also publish, it's public, it's on their website for all of the elections in member countries, a final report. And the final report outlines what was observed, the quality of the elections, and then also recommendations that the organization has for how the country can improve the quality of their elections. The OSCE is made up of 57 countries are currently members. This includes countries in North America, the United States and Canada, Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, the Caucasus, as well as Central Asia. countries invite the OSCE to observe elections in their countries. It's expected that they will be invited, but the OSCE doesn't just launch a mission the moment that they know an election is taking place. They wait for a formal invitation, and this becomes important in the Belarusian case in the elections that they had 2 months ago. So the election observation extends from North America all the way through Central Asia. On an election mission, there are three groups that are engaged. First, there's the core team. These are essentially people who have expertise in different areas of election observation, whether it's the politics in that country, the media, the legal system. There's also a security official that we have who briefs us on any security or health issues that we need to be concerned about. There's an ambassador and also a statistician, because as you'll see, we complete questionnaires as we are doing our observation. And these questionnaires are compiled statistically. So in the end, the OSCE can say, something like if 90% of the polling stations where we observed, the observers said that the elections process was carried out smoothly, for example, or at 10% of polling stations, the polling station opened after the official opening time. There are also long-term observers who are in the country, and they're in the country the same amount of time that the core team is. Long-term observers are usually in a country 5 to 6 weeks. So they are there something about 4 weeks prior to the election day, and then they're there for a week or so after the election. And they are observing different aspects of the campaign, because an election is about more than just what happens on election day. It's about the registration of candidates and voter registration rolls, and the campaigning and access to the media, and how disputes are being resolved. So long-term observers are in the country and in their locations throughout the country for 5 to 6 weeks. My role has been as a short-term observer. So I have gone typically for a week to the country where we have training, we observe the process for preparing the election, and then what happens on election day. So in Belarus in 2016, there were 38 long-term observers, 4 of them were Americans, and there are about 280 short-term observers, and we are sent to sort of districts or precinct areas throughout the country, and there were 40 Americans on that particular mission. So as short-term observers, our time in the country is really packed and quite intense. We have 2 days of training that covers everything that we need to know about the political system, the situation in the country, the rules governing and laws governing elections, problems that observers, the long-term observers, may have observed. And then we also learn how to perform our roles when we go out to the polling stations. We also, once we go to our destination where we'll be observing elections, the long-term observers give us a briefing on the politics, the dynamics, the social divisions, the cleavages in that particular region, and give us some guidance on what they have heard and what we might keep an eye out for if there are concerns. On election day, we visit usually around 10 polling stations. We spend a half hour, 45 minutes at a polling station. And we start the day prior to when the polls open and voters start to vote, because we start by observing the opening procedures. So when the poll workers arrive, we watch whether they are following the protocols. We ensure that they show us that the ballot box is empty, that there aren't already ballots in there. We ensure that the ballot box is sealed, or any other procedures that we need to be verifying and that are on our questionnaires. We then observe voting throughout the day. We move from polling station to polling station and fill out questionnaires at each of those. And then at the end of the day, we observe the closing procedures. And most importantly, this is the counting of ballots, the recording of the numbers of votes for each of the candidates, and also what is happening to invalid ballots or unused ballots. And then we follow the poll workers as they bring the ballots to the municipal election commissions. And there we watch the Municipal Election Commission process the ballots that are coming in from the polling station and how they are reporting it to the Central Election Commission. After our time in the region we were deployed to, we go back to the capital, and there we have debriefings where we can share more contextual information, and the core team can ask us questions so they get a better understanding if there are some systematic issues that have appeared in the reports that we are submitting. So I mentioned that as we are observing in polling stations, we complete questionnaires. So this is an example of a questionnaire from the book that we were filling out. I took this picture that is for observing of the voting. So this is during the day. And we record all kinds of information on this form so that the core team, they know what team number we are, they know exactly what polling station we are at, they know what time we arrived, what time we left. This can be important, the times, because the core team, if we go back to a polling station later, or we might have been there earlier in the morning, they can track whether the turnout numbers actually look reasonable given previous reports, or reports that are also happening in that area, that general area. So you can see on this slide some of the questions that we are asked to answer. So as we're going into the polling station, we observe the circumstances outside of the polling station. So specifically, were there campaign materials or campaign activity in the vicinity of the polling station? Was there tension or unrest? Was the polling station accessible to voters with disabilities? So are there stairs that they have to get up if someone is in a wheelchair or has difficulty walking? And you can see in this case, my answer to this was no, that it wasn't accessible, which I don't remember this particular polling station, but it's likely that there were stairs and not a ramp that people with disabilities could go up. Were there any indications outside of the polling stations that voters were being compelled to vote, or any other problems? So if there were other problems, I could check yes in the Y column, and there's a space in this booklet where we can then explain in our own words what kinds of problems we saw. We do this questionnaire is printed on very special paper. It has many, many, many tiny blue dots all over it. And we have a special digital pen that we use to mark our answers. The digital pen knows exactly where we are on the form. And we can then transmit, once we've completed the form, we can transmit the information that we have written down from our digital phone through a smartphone that feeds directly into an Excel spreadsheet with the core team in the capital, in this case in Minsk. So throughout the day, The core team can be doing analysis and starting to observe, are there any problems that they want more information about? And they can call us while we're in the field and say, have you seen this anywhere? Have you heard any party challengers raise such and such issue with you? So a little bit about Belarus, the background of Belarus. It has been independent since 1991 after the breakup of the Soviet Union. President Lukashenka was first elected in 1994, and he is still in his office, though after the August 9th election 2 months ago, it very much appears that he did not legitimately win that election. And so many governments, including the United States, are not currently recognizing him as the leader of the country. It is considered a dictatorship. Also by the US government, it is considered a dictatorship. The government has a lot of control over the media, which means that citizens don't get to hear really much criticism or any criticism at all of the government, except for now through social media or different kinds of messaging apps that are being used in the democratic uprising. The country maintains very close ties with Russia and has economic ties as well as political alliances with them. To give you a sense of the country, the population is 9.5 million people. The economy is largely state-controlled, and this is one of the tools that Lukashenka has had, at least, to try to get allegiance from citizens. If it's state-controlled, if factories are state-controlled, if universities are state-controlled, so many people then are reliant on the government for their income, for their future prospects, for their education. The country, as I mentioned as well, relies heavily on trade with Russia for low-priced oil and gas, as well as other types of economic aid. So I have some images here from 2016 in Belarus. So one of the features of this campaign that's pretty interesting, at least from American perspective or even a European perspective, is you really don't see candidates campaigning. You don't see candidate billboards or other indications that there are candidates who are running in a parliamentary election. Instead, what you see are these big signs, which is nearly as large as this building, which simply announce that elections will be held on September 11th, 2016. Here's another indication, another sign that is in front of one of the government buildings, also announcing the election, making sure that people are aware of it, excited about it. Elections are coming. In 2016, the parliament, which has 110 members, all of them were loyal to Lukashenka. So there were 0 opposition members of parliament in that parliament. A spoiler alert, after this election, the result of the election is that they did elect 2 members who were opponents of Lukashenka to the parliament. So it changed in a very minor way, the composition of parliament. One of the issues that the election observation noted was that at the beginning of this campaign, when candidates were being nominated to run for parliament, there were 620 of them who were nominated, but a really high number of them were disqualified or not permitted to register for small inadequacies, so things that in most other countries people would not be disqualified for. So sometimes this could just be simply not filling out the form correctly, missing a box, or extending a line beyond a box that needed to be checked, something like this. the point of this is one of the ways in which authoritarians can control elections. It's not always happening only on election day. It's controlling who can actually run for office. There's some unusual features of elections in dictatorships. So we can ask, why would a dictatorship hold an election? This is oftentimes because they want to show that the public largely supports them. They can get high voter turnout, and so therefore they are legitimate and can continue to rule. But another question is, like, how do you get voters to turn out to vote in a dictatorship? So as I mentioned, the state has a lot of control over people through their employment, through their education process. And they also, as you saw with the large billboards, they have a strong voter turnout campaign to get people to vote. They have early voting where every single one of the polling places is open Tuesday through Saturday prior to an election on Sunday. And they sometimes bus people from factories or their places of work to go vote. And so this is a way for the supervisors or the managers to actually see who's going to the polls that day. Same at the universities. So that's another method to ensure people are going to the polls. Another unusual feature, at least by democratic standards, is on election day, the elections are like a festival. So people want to show up to the polling places because there's entertainment, there's singing, there are cheerleaders, there are half-price food markets. So even if you don't care so much about voting, or maybe you've already voted, you might go back to the polling station again just to buy some goods for the week at this reduced price. And then there's very little to no candidate campaigning that was happening in this election. There were signs in the polling stations as you walked in that showed a picture of the candidates who were running in a short bio, but beyond that, very little evidence of a campaign. So I was observing in the southern part of Belarus, and on these missions, we are paired with one other observer. I was someone from a different country, so I would never be paired with someone from the United States. On this particular mission, my partner Jan, he is from Poland and works for the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So this is us in front of the Kalinkowicki Municipal Election Commission, where we were going to visit with the election administrators the day before the election. This is the morning of the election. We are waiting to be let into this polling station where we observe the opening procedures. The woman who's standing by the door, she had knocked on the door, is our interpreter. So on the mission, we also have an interpreter. And the actual observation mission occurs in English, and all of the reporting is in English. We are also assigned a driver, someone who's familiar with the area, and that obviously helps us get to the different polling stations. So this is a polling station, and as you see in this red and green sign that's in the window, this is announcing the information about the polling station. Also on the windows of the doors are some required material that needs to appear at the polling stations to inform voters about the polling process. This is in one of the polling stations that we visited, maybe one of my more favorite pictures from an election. So this is inside the polling station, and the woman in the blue dress is singing. She sang and performed for all the people who were sitting in the polling station for the full half hour that we were there. What's also interesting about this is in the front left corner, you will see a red box that has the masking tape around the top. That is actually the ballot box. So this is how close entertainment was happening to actually where people would be casting ballots. No one came in to vote during the time that we were here, but certainly this is not permitted in the US. An entertainer inside the polling station is not a legitimate person. The person does not have credentials to be in a polling station. This is one of the food markets that was just temporarily set up right outside the polling station entrance inside the building. And you can see at this one was more elaborate. Sometimes it was just baked goods, but you can get all kinds of alcohol. They had some meat in this refrigerator unit, pastries, chips, candies, whatever you needed. And these were at a reduced price because it was election day. Another example of sort of food or entertainment, at this polling station, the local sausage factory had a tasting literally 2 steps outside of the entrance to the room where polling took place. And in this picture, the people's arms that you see, one is Jan in the suit on the left and our interpreter in the pink sweater. So we talked to this woman about the sausage before we went in to observe the election. This is one of the polling stations that we visited. They were all properly set up that morning, waiting for some voters to come in. We went back to the same polling station at the end of the day to watch them count the ballots. So we watched the last 15 minutes, maybe half hour of voting at that polling station. And then the counting happened. And so we were seated along the edge of the room, and normally on an election mission, we would not be touching ballots ever, but we would be able to stand near the people and watch them. Sometimes they will show us the ballots and then put it in clear piles so that we know that they're counting them and putting them in the appropriate piles. We were not permitted to move from our seats. So this is on full zoom with my camera. And you can see the paper is quite chaotic on this table. This group of people, they counted just over 1,000 ballots in 20 minutes. I have never ever seen counting happen that quickly, at least when I have observed, because usually they show each ballot to all of the observers in the room, and there were domestic observers. And so counting 1,000 ballots in a proper way might take actually an hour or so. So it took them 20 minutes. They just simply announced the numbers. They added up the numbers. In this polling station, they were 1 number off, which isn't such a big deal. But usually in a polling station, if that happens, they focus on being precise and accurate, and they will do another count to see if they miscounted along the way. So that didn't happen here. They finished up quickly and filled out the protocol forms, and off to the Municipal Election Commission they went, and we followed them to observe after that. So as I mentioned, the results of this election, 2 opposition members who are pictured here, 1 seats in Parliament, so still overwhelmingly controlled or run by Lukashenko loyalists. The OSCE report on this election, it's available if you want to read the whole thing, it's available on the OSCE website if you look under Belarus. It's a very thorough, detailed report, but I've picked out a couple of things that stood out to me about long-standing systemic shortcomings in the elections. So these are things that they have observed over and over in the country. So first, restrictions on candidates' activities and rallies really meant that the campaign was not visible to citizens. The media coverage only focused on good things about Lukashenko, and it really didn't inform voters of the choices that they had. The OSCE also noted irregularities in voting and the tabulation or counting process. In some instances, observers noted that there were more ballots that were voted than the number of people who signed in. They also noticed the hasty counting of ballots by poll workers, and that was something that you saw that we observed in our station. So let's fast forward to recent events. So this past summer, Belarus announced that they would be having presidential elections. And of course, the OSCE was waiting for the government to invite them to observe. So as they're waiting and waiting and waiting, at some point, you get to a point where it is too late to start an election observation mission, because candidates, the registration of candidates, that process has already started. And we know that that's an important part of the whole election administration procedures. The election was held on August 9th. And a few weeks before that, on July 15th, ODIHR, which is a division of the OSCE, announced that they would not be deploying an election observation mission to Belarus because they did not receive an official invitation. So you can see the first two paragraphs of this announcement. It's a longer announcement than that, but really they note that you know, they were waiting for an invitation. It's been 2 months after they announced it, and that they wouldn't be able to observe key aspects of the election process. So for the August 9th election, the OSCE was not observing in the country. This election was an interesting election, an interesting presidential election. Lukashenko has had challengers before, so that's not new. But what is new is the kind of outpouring of support that these three women in this picture, and particularly Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is in the middle of this picture with her hand in a fist, they had tremendous support from the public in the election process. Tikhanovskaya's husband was the one who was actually running for president, and he was detained and not permitted to run. He's still in jail. He's being detained. And Tikhanovskaya, she has not been engaged in politics in the past. She doesn't see herself as a politician, but she has become the leading figure of the opposition. And she, along with Maria and Veronica, who are pictured here, became the leaders of this movement. And if you read about the democratic uprising that is happening, one thing that many observers remark on is that this has been an uprising that has been led so much, not exclusively, but so much by women. Not just these three women leaders here, but also in the aftermath of the election and trying to negotiate with the government, the Coordination Council also has a number of women on it. The official election results you see here, Lukashenko claims that he won 80% support in the election, and then Tikhanovskaya only got 10% support. This really unbalanced result may be part of why the entire country began protesting immediately. If he had perhaps said he won by 55%, maybe none of this would have happened, that the democratic uprising would not have been instigated. But the people, the public seemed to know that that 10% result for Tikhanovskaya could not possibly be the result. And there were some polling stations that could demonstrate that that really isn't possible, that there was overwhelming support in certain precincts for Tikhanovskaya that were not necessarily recorded that way in the official results. Tikhanovskaya had to leave the country. She fled the country. The full circumstances are not known, but it is widely understood that she was threatened by the regime, and within a couple of days of the election, she fled. The protests started the night of the election, and the citizens have been protesting every single day, and that's over 2 months now. But really the protests on the weekends have been enormous. So in a few instances, in a few of these protests, over 100,000 people, but certainly tens of thousands of people still turning out on weekends for protests. So this particular image is from August 16th, a week after the election. This one is from September. This is obviously from a Twitter image of the protests that were continuing. And as I said, they continue every weekend to the present. These protests have also been met by police brutality, beatings, imprisonment of many people. This is one image that is a tamer image, the police who are wrestling with a female protester. But there are some really horrific images of people who are bleeding with broken bones, or people who have been released from prison, but who have terrible bruises and swelling, and there have also been some people who have died in this process. So human rights organizations have also issued statements, and releasing the prisoners is a call of the opposition today, as well as new free and fair elections. The women who are at the head of this movement are now in different places. Tikhanovskaya, who is in the center here, she is in Lithuania. She has been in other European countries since then, but she is essentially residing in Lithuania right now. And it seems to me, from as I have followed this, that the Lithuanian government has been incredibly supportive of this uprising, as well as sort of assisting her in this process. She's not a politician, but has very much found her own voice and has met with Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and Macron, and has spoken to members of the European Parliament. So very much making herself known, and the challenges that Belarus is facing on the international stage. The others, Maria, who is on the right, the Belarusian government tried to force her out of the country and into Ukraine, and reportedly she ripped up her passport at the border, and so she is in prison right now, or in detention in Belarus. And Veronica is also abroad. She is no longer in Belarus, and recently met face-to-face with Tikhanovskaya. So one of the questions is, how will this revolution, or potentially a revolution, this democratic uprising, end? This has become very much an international issue, with Lukashenko turning to Russia. This is an image of him meeting with Putin in September. Putin guaranteed him $1.5 billion in loans to help support the country through this time when companies are going on strike and the uprising is causing economic disruptions. On the right, you can see Tikhanovskaya is meeting with the president of the European Parliament. So the West, Europe, as well as the United States and Canada, Switzerland as well, have spoken out against the violence in Belarus, have not recognized Lukashenko as the legitimate president of the country. More recently this month, the United States and the European Union have issued sanctions against individuals or government officials in Belarus. And just a couple days ago, the opposition, Tikhanovskaya, and the Coordination Council, they have issued essentially an ultimatum that if Lukashenko does not resign by the 26th of October, there will be a massive nationwide strike that will begin. So that is the most recent news, but it seems that right now, things haven't changed really much since the time right after the election. So we will have to wait to see how this unfolds. So thank you so much for your attention. And I welcome any questions that you might have about election observation, my experiences doing that work, or Belarus.
Thank you so much, Mary. This is really great. It's been helpful for me because I've been trying to follow these events, but this really helps sort of organize it in my mind. And it's especially helpful to have that 2016 background to understand kind of the context of what's been going on this year. So I'm encouraging our audience to send in your questions using the Q&A tab on Zoom or the live chat on YouTube. I saw the first question that came in. It was a great opening question, which is, how do you become an observer?
Mm-hmm. That's a terrific question. So the answer to that sort of depends upon what country you are a citizen of. So in the United States, if you're a US citizen, it's the US State Department that deploys US election observers, and they use a contractor called PAE-React that does the recruitment and deployment of observers. So you can go to the PAE-React Opportunities website, and they have all different types of job opportunities through the OSCE, but also election observation opportunities. So you can apply there. They do look for people who have some international experience. In the region is helpful, meaning in Central, Eastern Europe, Russia, etc. It's not a requirement, though. One thing that they do require is that all US observers have to have experience working at the polls in the United States on election day. So some people who do this for the United States are like county clerks, are state election officials. I'm obviously a university faculty member, so I have on a number of occasions worked at the polls on election day. I used to live in Virginia, but also here in Boone County, Missouri, and I'm planning to work on election day this year, November 3rd. If you are a citizen of another country, it is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the various member states that deploy election observers. I know some Czech election observers who do this work. There are different approaches that the Czech government uses, so they can be Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials, but they do also select other people with some international expertise to observe on these missions.
Well, an obvious follow-up question for prospective observers. Are observers compensated?
Yeah, well, so yes and no. So for the US observers, this is a volunteer position, so we don't get a salary or a stipend to do this, but all of our expenses are paid, like absolutely all of our expenses are paid, unless we're doing things that, are not covered. But we do get a meal per diem, our hotel is covered, the transportation is either provided for, or we are reimbursed for those types of expenses. In some other countries, they do pay observers some kind of stipend for a mission in addition to covering their costs.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So more questions coming in. The next one, well, I think pretty obvious, but maybe you could expand in your response. Is there tension among Belarusian citizens, or Belarusian citizens, I should say, regarding the outcome of this 2020 election?
Yes, so, you know, there are supporters of Lukashenka, and he has organized, or his team has helped organize some counter protests to the opposition, the democratic opposition protests. But the images that I have seen, you know, on social media in particular, these protests are not nearly as widely attended as the opposition protests. So there is some tension around it. Of course, there are always people who are invested in the current regime or are loyal to the leader. So there is tension, but I have also been surprised, and maybe internationally there has been some surprise or recognition when the whole factories go on strike. Also outside of Minsk and other areas of the country. So the protests aren't happening only in Minsk, they're happening in many of the large cities, as well as places of employment.
Okay. So another question here. Have you been an observer in other countries, and can you decide where you want to go to observe?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I have observed in other countries. I have been to Albania, to Macedonia twice. It's now North Macedonia, but when I was there, it was Macedonia those 2 times, and Kyrgyzstan. I've been to Kyrgyzstan twice. So for US observers, we are allowed to go, or they will select us once a year. So we can't usually go twice in 1 year, in a 1-year period. But yes, we do apply for particular missions. So when I think about where will my next election mission be, I think about what is my schedule like? Can I take a week off at this point? If it's in the semester, if it's in the summer, or do I have other big events that I might miss? But I also do enjoy going back to countries that I've been to because I learn a lot about the country. I stay in touch with the interpreters, so it's an opportunity for me to touch base with people who I got to know really well on a particular mission. But it's also useful for my teaching because if I am teaching a comparative elections course or speaking to groups, then I have a better background in that particular country.
That's great. 2-part question here. Is the OSCE the only body that sends observers, and how is it funded?
There are other organizations that send observers to some of these elections. There are, the European Parliament sometimes sends a group. The embassies from the countries can also sometimes decide to register observers outside of the OSCE process. There are other organizations as well. So the Carter Institute, for example, or the Carter Center, though they don't usually do elections in the countries that the OSCE covers. The Carter Center is more places in Africa, and I have not observed through them. Russia has an organization of some of their allies that also does election observation. So in Belarus, there were some Russian observers that were not part of the OSCE mission, but of this separate mission. But the OSCE is the main organization for the countries that are members that does this kind of election observation. Mm-hmm.
And the other part of the question was about how OSCE is funded?
Funded, yes. So the member states, the 57 countries that are members of the OSCE, provide funding through their membership dues to the OSCE. And on the election missions, the OSCE covers some of our costs, as part of the funding that they receive from countries, but then the State Department or the Ministries of Foreign Affairs of specific countries cover another section of the cost. And all of that is really transparent to us. When we are invited to join a mission, we get all the information. These are the costs that the OSCE is covering. These are the costs that the governments, the countries need to cover for their observers.
Great. I had a sort of a follow-up question on your comparative experience observing in different countries. Does your experience vary a lot from country to country in terms of how cordial the reception is for the observers or the conditions under which you end up working?
It does. It varies a good bit, and sometimes it depends upon the particular conditions around the election, whether there's some tension around elections. It also depends upon where I am actually located. So Kyrgyzstan, I think, is a great example of a country where I've been there twice, have observed in a suburb of Bishkek, the capital city, but then also on the second mission in rural villages in the middle of the mountains. It was gorgeous. Wow. And so villagers who have never, my partner on that mission was from Poland as well, as in Belarus. Michal was his name. The people in those villages had never met an American. They had never met someone from Poland. They were excited to see us. We were, invited to go to their house so that they were going to, feed us a big buffet. We can't do that on a mission, right? But it's so generous of people. And then I will say in Belarus, people were welcoming, but also a little bit cold when we were asking them questions. And on the day before the election, the Saturday before the Sunday election, we observed twice 4 polling stations. We went to the same ones twice at different times in the day. And in particular, at one of those polling stations, they were nice to us when we arrived in the morning, and when we came back, they were not very happy and would not answer any of the questions that we asked them. And we sat there for a half hour because that's what we're supposed to do. And we, just had to say they wouldn't answer. They wouldn't tell us how many people had voted. So the conditions in the particular polling stations and circumstances of the elections matter. But I haven't ever felt unsafe, and we do have, security briefings. So in Kyrgyzstan, I was near Osh in the mountains, but to the west of Osh, near the Uzbek border, there in the past have been tensions, and so and scuffles, border tensions, and so we are instructed specifically where we are not permitted to go, and they don't send us into places where there is unrest or where they expect there really might be significant unrest. And if we feel threatened or unsafe as we go into a polling station, we're told, don't go in, go back to the car, give us a call, tell us what's happening, and go to another polling station.
Another question came in. Can you tell us a little about the scale of these observation operations? Like how many observers per town or per station, and how many stations or towns get covered?
So this depends on how many observers are actually deployed by the countries within the OSCE. The OSCE does an analysis before the start of a mission, before they start recruiting observers from the member states, to determine what kind of election observation mission they will run. So in the West European countries, in a place like France or Germany, if there aren't any serious concerns that election stakeholders are expressing, they might just do a very limited mission, just sending some experts in. It's also possible to do a limited election observation mission where it's just experts and some long-term observers, but not short-term observers. So there are variations depending on conditions in the country. In countries that have larger populations, they will request a higher number of observers. When I've been to Kyrgyzstan, it has usually been around 300 or 350 observers, short-term observers. A place like Ukraine, they have asked for, 500 or 600 observers. And we are deployed to regions, and then in the region of the country, we then get a particular area, geographic area. And there might be 20 or 30 polling stations in that area, and we get to randomly select which polling stations we will visit. We don't tell the polling stations that we're going to be stopping by. They know that there could be observers, international observers coming. And we also don't tell the interpreter or driver until we're moving on to the next polling station, so that those polling stations don't have a chance really to prepare specially for us, that we are actually observing when we walk in what the election administration looks like at that time.
Okay. Another question came in. Have you ever seen long lines at polling stations, like maybe the ones we saw in some state primary elections in the US recently? And would a shortage of polling stations or overrun polling stations be something that election observers would make note of?
Yes. So I have not seen long lines, meaning in my time doing election observation, I probably have not seen a line that someone would need to stand in longer than 10 or 15 minutes at the most. So really, nothing like there's a half-hour line that people have to stand in. There may be other reasons for that, though, because most other countries have elections on a weekend. And in the United States, having elections on a Tuesday means many people go before work, they go on their lunch break, or they go after work, which means that you don't have voting spread out throughout the day in a way that you might if an election were on a Saturday or a Sunday. Some people are early risers and will go to the polls first thing in the morning. Some people will go vote when they're doing their errands throughout the day, depending on what they're doing. It is something, if we saw long lines, something that we would report on. We are asked a question usually on the questionnaires about whether there's crowding in a polling station. So too many people in the polling station, because that can obscure some fraudulent practices. So you don't want to see overcrowding. But poll workers where I have observed have also been, because sometimes the space is just too small for an election. So the poll workers are usually aware of this as a potential problem and will ask people to stay outside until another voter leaves the building. But I have seen voting in pretty cramped spaces.
Well, since that last question led us in this direction, I'm going to have to follow up. You said that, of course, you won't be observing elections in the US. One does not observe elections for OSCE in one's own country, but you know people who might be observing in the US. What are they going to be looking for in our elections this November or October? We're already voting, right?
Yes, exactly. So the OSCE does have a mission to the United States. They were hoping to have a regular mission with short-term observers as well, but because of the pandemic and travel restrictions, as well as if Europeans come here, they can observe elections, but when they go home, they have to quarantine in most cases for 14 days. And in many of the European countries, the quarantines are much stricter, more strictly enforced than they are here. Some instances with police actually checking in to make sure people are where they say they are quarantining. So this has really hampered the OSCE's ability to recruit enough observers. So this election mission in the United States is now a limited election election mission. There are 30 long-term observers and the core team who are currently here. The mission started at the end of September. The 30 observers are distributed across the United States. I was reading yesterday, I think they will be observing in about 28 different states. A friend of mine who happens to be Czech is here in the US as one of the long-term observers, and she is in 2 southern states observing. So right now she's in one state. Next week they will be moving to the next state through election day. And in these elections, so they will be meeting potentially with candidates or the teams representing the candidates. They will be talking with county clerks, state election officials. So usually these long-term observers are in the capital cities, but then can travel around the state. They can be observing early voting, the process in the county clerk's offices for absentee ballots. And on election day, they will be, keeping track of what's happening throughout the day and the counting process. And a counting process that might last a couple of days, depending on the state and their specific absentee voting rules, when the absentee ballots need to be in by, and when counting of those ballots can begin.
Yeah. So I guess one last question I have is, what is the biggest irregularity you have observed? Would it be some of the conditions you described in Belarus, or were there other incidents that were even more remarkable somewhere else?
Yeah, so in Belarus, the counting of the ballots, I had never seen counting like that. I have also seen in Kyrgyzstan, in a couple, meaning 3, I think it was, polling stations where one of the candidates' teams or one of the party's teams actually had set up some video recorders in polling stations that was set up to watch the ballot box, and it was recording the ballot box. And this was something that was challenged later in the day by some of the opposition party team members. But I was astonished when I first saw it. It was at the opening of a polling station. We had an opening ceremony there, so we were all standing. And when I went to sit down and take my seat, I sat down to observe the beginning of voting and watch voter check-in, and I realized that suddenly a camera was set up, a smartphone that was recording on a tripod, and I was like, what is this? And one of the party observers was there and explained that they were doing that for transparency in the election process. So that would not be permitted in the United States or most other Western countries, established democracies.
Well, great. Well, Mary, thank you so much for your presentation today and your responses to our questions that came in. It is, of course, a timely topic in Belarus and here. So I guess as I say goodnight to everyone, I want to wish everyone a happy election. I hope you all make it to the polls in whatever form you choose, and that your vote gets counted. So thank you again, Mary, and thanks everyone for joining our program. Come see us at SVU New York or Harriman Institute again soon. We look forward to the next event. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris.